So hi, everyone. Nice to see you. Rotary Club of Cultural Exchange Enthusiasts. Hopefully a few more people will log on. A reminder about our in-person gathering in Osceola on October 9th and lunch. So looking really forward to that. Tanya, as mentioned last week, you are very, very, very welcome to join us. So it'd be really nice if you are available, and if you would like to, please do.
Thank you.
This next page is my fun new addition to the weekly PowerPoint. This is E-Club President-elect. Could it be you? And just to put people's, like to get them in the spirit, I'll be rotating out different members' photos once a week. And so I'm going to start with Greg White this week, E-Club President-elect for July 2022 to 2023.
My shoulder really hurts because my arm's being twisted so hard.
Could it be you? And don't worry, Greg, because I'll be twisting arms for everyone else in the club as the weeks go on. But now's the time to consider whether you would like to be president for the next term. It looks great on a resume. It's a lot of fun, and it would give John a break after doing it here for 2.5 years. But happy to continue supporting the club in other ways. But I think it's, in fairness, I think it's time to have someone take the presidency for a year. Typically how Rotary clubs work is that you kind of commit to a year and you're behind the scenes the year before. You take the reins for a year, and then you're here to help, others the year afterwards. We're such a small club that we kind of all help each other anyway. So, but I thought that was fun. I thought, who could I start with? Who can I put into the frying pan first? And Greg, your photo was readily available. And so there you go.
It's such an old photo of me.
It's the one that keeps circulating. So new members, our goal is 25 members by the end of the year. I think we might just make it $270 a year for our memberships. We would love to have you as a new member. Tanya, you're our only guest today, so I'll say it again. We would love to have you as a new member. I think Chris-Anne said that you had indicated you might be interested in joining. So,
well, I probably would be, but maybe when I retire, because I can't often make a 4:30 meeting because of my work. Yeah.
Sure, of course. So, well, you're welcome to join anytime, and I'm glad
Thank you.
Today. And of course, the friend of a club for people in your lives who might be Rotarians to come and join us and donate a new Rotary Club that's just coming up here, $100 donation with access to every meetings and unlimited Rotary makeups. All right. Next week's meeting is our E-Club Happy Hour. So it's just a time for members to hang out and catch up with each other and talk about anything, have a glass of wine or a beer or a beverage or a Coke or coffee or tea. And so look forward to that next week. And we'll do a little bit of club planning as well. And so which brings us to today's speaker, Jane. Genie or Mr. Jane. I'm curious to hear all about that and your E-Club member introduction, as well as some cross-cultural lessons from Afghanistan. So I'm going to stop sharing and I'm going to turn it over to you.
And I will take myself off mute first thing. And can I share then my screen? Okay. Let's see. And here I am. Hopefully this shares. I don't know why it always takes me so long to get going, when I'm sharing something here. And I'm going to hold off here a little bit on explaining Genie or Mr. Jane, but we're going to get to that. I'm going to start out just giving you a little bit of background that will explain to you how I ended up in Afghanistan, and it ties in Rotary and growing up and all kinds of things. So I moved around a lot as a child because my father was in and out of medical training, in school and then internship and then residency. And in the middle of that, he got called up to Korean War. And so we got moved around a lot. And this is me at the Alamo. And I believe I'm about 3 at the time. So that's the first thing I want you to know about, that I moved around a lot. The second thing is that my family had 3 exchange students. I think I mentioned that last week. And this is the family. Yes, that's me and those wingtip glasses over there on the right. But our foreign student was Sonoko Hayashi from Japan, and she lived with us for a year. And then the other 2 exchange students we had were from England and Northern Ireland, and we inherited them because their original placements didn't work out. And then I also, the third thing that I think influenced my going to Peace Corps, my parents worked as medical missionaries. My dad was a surgeon. My mother spoke Spanish and had done partial nurses training. She actually later became a teacher. And this is them down in Sisagichi, Mexico, where they would fly in and Dad would do surgery for 2 weeks at a time. And when I say fly in, my dad flew his own plane in to this mission that was there. So then the fourth thing is I want to say I had very strong role models, not just my mother, who went back to college while I was in college, and she graduated the year before I did. But this is my grandmother, who graduated from medical school at the age of 20 during World War I. And she was, because she was under 21, she couldn't practice. And so she became an instructor in the medical school, and that's how she met my grandfather. So that my grandmother, grandfather, great aunt, and brother were all physicians. And then the final thing that was an influence on me was prior to going into the Peace Corps, while I was in school, I actually went to school in Luxembourg. That was my first taste of living overseas. And we lived in a castle in Luxembourg. It was great. And this is actually a picture of the student center, which had been like the old carriage house or something for the castle. And it was still under construction when we were there. So that kind of sets me up. Let me back. Well, I'll get started here. I graduated from college and didn't know what I was going to do. I had a degree in English Lit. I don't know what you do with a degree in English Lit. And I went into the Career Center and said, what am I going to do? And they said, what do you want to do? And I said, Peace Corps. And they said, well, there was a guy here last week recruiting, and it's a special 3-year program. You're going to get a master's degree out of it. You do 1 year in the Teacher Corps and 2 years in Afghanistan. And at that point I went, whoa. When I was 13, I read a book called Caravans by James Michener. I don't know if any of you have read that book. You've all heard of Michener, but I read that book and told my parents, that's one country in the world I never want to go to. So after I was taken aback by their announcement, I went, this is fate. I have to apply for this program. And I did. I was accepted. I was out of college for only 2 weeks, I think, before we started training. We went to Lackawanna, New York. We were grad students at Buffalo State in Buffalo. Lackawanna is a suburb of Buffalo. And this guy, this handsome young man, Ahad Shabazz, was our language instructor and our cross-cultural instructor. And unlike most Peace Corps volunteers, we got a whole year of preparation because he gave us our language either in Dari or in Pashto. He's a multilingual speaker. And he had been a teacher in Peace Corps in Afghanistan. And He had been sent to the US to do his undergraduate and then his graduate degree. So he did his graduate degree at Buffalo State and was our instructor. So I was actually able to arrive in Kabul speaking Dari, which is dialect of Farsi, and just getting off the plane, we could all talk to everybody that was around us. This is Afghanistan. I thought I should give you a little bit of orientation here. Can you see my cursor? Okay. Here's Kabul. Here's the capital of Afghanistan. And when I was there was one road, and it was this ring road that went down here and around and up to Herat, and then went up north to Mazar. These little side roads didn't exist at all. And I did some additional training in Kabul for a few weeks. And then I went to Lashkargah, which is down here. It's the capital of Helmand province. It's an oasis. It's where the Helmand and the Arghandab rivers meet. And you can see just below the name of Lashkargah, it's the Dasht Margo desert. And Dasht Margo means the desert of death. So I spent 2 years living in the desert of death. Now, at the time that I was in Afghanistan, there were only about 8 to 12 million people. It's now at least 3 times that in size. Life expectancy was about 37 for men, and it was about 25 for women. And that's in part because women, as soon as they reached puberty, started having children, and there was very high maternal mortality as well as infant mortality. There were then and still are 2 major languages, as I said, Pashto and Farsi or Dari. Pashto is spoken down here, and it is the language of the Pashtuns, who consider themselves the only Afghans. The rest of the people are just kind of like others, but the Pashtuns consider themselves, the name, to be synonymous with being Afghan. So notice I said this is where Pashto is spoken, but I learned Dari, and they sent me down to Pashtunistan, which is kind of like typical of government, but they had an actual rationale, which I will get to here. At the time when I arrived, there were several nomads who still lived in Afghanistan. Actually, they freely crossed borders into Uzbekistan and Turkestan. So there were a lot of wandering nomads, but Lashkargah was unique in that there was a village next to us where the nomads had actually been permanently settled. And that kind of comes into play later on. In 1972, if anyone had a vision of Afghanistan, it might have been this, if they had even heard of Afghanistan. Most of my family thought I was going to Africa because they had no idea where Afghanistan was. So here's Kabul back in 1972, although actually my dad took these pictures. He visited me and made up Rotary in Kabul. So this is in 73 when he was there. Kabul was still a very non-technological city. The population was maybe around 100,000. And it's much, much larger now. You can see in this second picture where there are some buildings up in the mountains. Now these mountains are completely covered with development. There's no longer any farming going on within the town. And so this is all changed. You don't see the sheep in the street anymore because Kabul's one big traffic jam. And I didn't take so many good pictures. My dad gave me all the good pictures of Afghanistan, and someone else took this picture. That's me in the Peace Corps training office. Now, after I finished my training in Kabul, I got sent to Lashkargah, and Lashkargah means barracks. It was the winter capital of the Ghaznavid Empire, and this structure was their castle. It was called Fort Bost, which is Kalabost in Farsi. And this is still one of the more famous ruins in Afghanistan. And these are the gates to the fort. But you can see over here, there's this large diked area. That was actually where the soldiers lived. That was the barracks. Now we're talking, when I say Ghaznavid Empire, you don't know what that means at all. The Ghaznavid Empire was in the 10th and 11th centuries. So that's what these ruins date from. And here I am in my bedroom. My sister was asking me today where Afghans sleep, because we were talking about the refugees and what the refugees might be used to. The Afghans sleep typically on pillows on the floor, very similar to Japanese futons. And they thought we were all very strange that we insisted on elevated beds. So this structure is actually called a charpoy, which means 4 legs. And they thought we were basically sleeping on tables. And this is how I got to work every day. I was required to live in the capital as a single woman, but I actually taught 12 miles outside of town. And so I had a driver that took me out to work every day. This is my kitchen in my house. And this guy is not Afghan. He is Filipino. There are a number of Filipinos living in Lashkargah, employed by USAID, which had a separate office down in Lashkargah. And the key things here, you can see I had a refrigerator. Unfortunately, I only had electricity every other day. And you can see sort of, this is a sink right here. I had running water, but also every other day. And it was the opposite day from when I had electricity. So operating the kitchen was definitely a balancing act. And these are my plumbers. I actually had a Western style toilet. I had a shower. And every so often, the plumbing would get clogged. And that was because it was really just a pipe that went out into the garden. That's where all of the black water and gray water went, was out into the garden. This is my living room. And you can see I still have, I had some of this charpoy furniture there. And I wanted to give you an idea of what women did in the town where I lived. This woman was a saleswoman, and she would come to my house maybe once a week and sell clothes that women in the village had made. And the village is outside of Lashkargah. And a lot of times these were embroidered items. They were really beautiful. But they couldn't go outside their homes typically to try and sell. This woman was a widow, and she was blind in one eye. And so she had no means of support other than to sell these items for the other women in town. But some women were professional. So this woman is a nurse. I met 2 women nurses in Afghanistan. She was a nurse in the Peace Corps office, but there was also a nurse at the place where I worked. And this guy was a teacher at Peace Corps office. Now, most of the time yes.
Can you remind me what year this is again, please?
1972 to 1974.
Thank you very much.
I spent most of my time with this family. This guy on the right is named Obaidullah. He was my housekeeper. All Peace Corps volunteers had servants. I know you don't think about Peace Corps volunteers having servants, but we all did, and our servants had servants. For instance, this woman was Obaidullah's niece, and she and her husband did not have very much money, so she was Obaidullah's wife's servant. So they all lived together in this house. This is Obaidullah's wife, Gawar, on the left. The woman in the center is Obaidullah's mother. And this young man next to Gawar, the wife, is her brother. The two little girls are two of their three children. And then this little boy is a nephew, but not directly related to the niece that lived with him. And here's just a better picture of Obaidullah. He's actually, in fact, sitting in my bedroom. I can recognize that. Obaidullah was probably in his late 30s. Gawar was 19 when I first met her. And their oldest child was 7. So do the math. She married Obaidullah when she was 11 or 12 years old. And he was probably 30, around 30, somewhere in there. And that is typical of that time for the age difference. In part because a man had to prove that he could support a wife, and typically they had to be older to show that. And part of the way they showed that was they gave a large amount of money to the bride's family. And that's frequently referred to as a bride price, but that's not really what it was. It functioned more as a dowry. It was meant to set up the family. It was used by Gawar's family to establish her household, to give her money for household goods, for her clothes, and those kinds of things. So it's kind of a Western bad interpretation to call it a bride price. This is me with Gawar, just to give you an idea of the difference in stature for Afghans. Gawar was probably less than 5 feet tall, and I would say that Obaidullah was maybe 5'6". The Afghans are generally smaller people than Americans are. This is a celebration I was at, and they had made me this dress. This is the national costume of Afghanistan. They made this dress for me. The bodice is completely covered in embroidery. And they made all these necklaces and gave me all this jewelry. And you can see that Gawar is wearing a similar dress. And then this is the son. This is Aminullah, their son. This was an interesting celebration. It was for women only. It took place in the spring. There were certain foods that we ate it was like a party. And to me, it was very clearly a fertility rite. It involved seeds. It involved eggs. You know, there's all kinds of like Easter symbology in there that we also have borrowed in celebrating Easter. This is Gawar at work within the home. The kitchen is always outside of the living area because of the heat. This was a desert. In the summertime, it got up into the 120s. So this is the oven, and Gawar is making bread. She would, and this is very similar to a tandoor for those of you familiar with Indian food. So she would slap the dough up against the side of this hot oven, and as it started to fall, she would grab it. I hope you notice she does have an insulated glove on her hand. She was not sticking her hand down there. And here, again, this is typical of my photography, not real good, but here she is in the kitchen part other than the oven, and she's making soup for the family. Typically, Afghans would have bread and tea for breakfast. For lunch, they would have rice and vegetables, and they wouldn't necessarily eat an evening meal. Meat was rarely eaten. It was only part of celebrations. So, for instance, I was invited to a circumcision, which is a big celebration when a little boy gets circumcised at the age of 6 or 7. And they did have a lot of meat at that celebration. And here are the two little girls again, playing in the courtyard. The homes are all made of an adobe type of clay. And this building over here to the left is separate. These are the living quarters. This is the bathroom. And it was basically surrounding a hole in the ground. It was like a latrine. And here is Aziza, the oldest daughter, dancing for us at a party. The interesting thing for me with the family was that the children were spaced out. And I asked about that, and it turned out that Gawar actually was on birth control pills. And this is 1972. One of her many, many cousins was a male nurse at the hospital, and he obtained birth control pills for her. And here is Aminullah again, close up. And here are the kids all dressed up. My mother had sent Aminullah some jeans and a t-shirt, and she sent Barbie dolls to Aziza and Rahima. My mother was, shall we say, not culturally sensitive on what was acceptable for Muslims. Dolls are not acceptable, and dolls are not part of their culture. This is a close-up of Obaidullah's mother, and she was probably the oldest woman I met. She was, I look back on it now, she's probably only in her 50s, her early 50s, because, she probably had Obaidullah when she was in her teens. And so she can't have been that old. But she was actually 2 decades older than most Afghan women would survive to, because her husband died young. And she was well off enough. She did not have to marry again. For those of you who remember the book of Ruth in the Bible, and Ruth married her brother-in-law after her husband died, that was typically what Afghan women would do, is that they would marry their brother-in-law. And it didn't necessarily mean that the brother-in-law was not married. That's how guys would end up with multiple wives, is if they inherited a wife from one of their siblings. Obaidullah's mother actually lived another 7 years. So she might have made it to 60. Now, this is where I actually worked. And just so you know, John, I am keeping track of the time. This is where I work. It had been a Morrison Knudsen construction camp built by the Americans. So you can kind of recognize American construction architecture. It was nationalized by the Afghan government. And this is kind of the whole compound here, complete with our own wandering sheep. And then the building here in the background was my classroom. My students were all adults. This construction camp employed 1,000 men and 1 woman. The other nurse that I met was a woman at this construction camp. These guys came from all over Afghanistan, and that is why I had been trained in Dari rather than in Pashto, because only the Pashtuns speak Pashto, whereas everyone else will speak their first language plus Dari, if Dari is not their first language. So it is the lingua franca of Afghanistan. And I could communicate with them in Dari if I needed to. Most of these guys already spoke English. They were engineers, they were accountants, they were warehouse personnel that handled procurement for the camp. And many of them worked with USAID personnel. So they all had different reasons why they needed to have English. The money for the construction project that we were involved in was coming from the US. And when the US gives money, I don't know if any of you have been involved in government at the federal level or international level, but when we give money to a country, we require that they spend it in the US. So all of these supplies were being purchased from the US. And so all of the supplies were ordered in English. Just some more of my students. The guy here in white was actually the cook for the construction camp. And I loved him from the very beginning because every day at 4 o'clock, he brought me tea and pound cake. And where he learned to make pound cake, I don't know, but he brought it to me every day. And yes, I did gain weight in Afghanistan. Both Obaidullah and the cook were very good at meal prep. So these were all my students. Now, one of the things that they, again, I said they were relatively short stature people. A running joke was to try and find someone who was as tall as I was. And back then, I was 5'9". They came within a 1/4 inch of finding someone who was as tall as I was. And that was this guy back here. His name was Ghulam Dostagir. And that's why I remember him, because he was almost as tall as I was. So what does it mean, Genie or Mr. Jane? You've probably heard in movies that take place in India where the Indians refer to the British Raj. The women of the British Raj were Mem Sahib. Sahib means either ma'am or sir, but it also translates as Mr. as a title. And I was the teacher, so I was a person of stature, and they knew my first name was Jane. Most Afghans don't have last names, so they only cared about my first name. And so I was Jane Sahib, but they translated it as Mr. Jane. So that was what my students called me. Jane, the eh sound in Jane actually is not found in this dialect of Farsi. It's more of an I. And so Jane comes out as Jinn. Jinn is a spirit or a genie in the Persian mythology. And so my cook called me Genie as a joke because he was thinking of me as a spirit, just like in Aladdin or I Dream of Genie. When I returned to Afghanistan a couple of years after I left, someone sent word. I arrived at night, and someone sent word out to the village to tell Obaidullah that I was back. And I was walking in the dark. It was perfectly safe for me to walk in the dark down a street to go to the U.S. staff house to get a drink. And this voice comes out of the darkness as a bicycle goes by, and it's Genie, Genie. And it was Obaidullah. He had come down to see if he could find me. And he knew I'd be heading for the staff house. So this is not Afghanistan. I kind of wanted to go from, that was kind of my life in Afghanistan as Mr. Jane or as Genie. And I moved on from 2 years in Afghanistan to spending 2 years in Iran. And that's where this is. That's not me. That was my co-teacher. We taught helicopter pilots of the Imperial Iranian Army Aviation Corps. And so we taught on a base. The equipment was all American equipment. Our students were helicopter pilots, and they were all Bell helicopters that they were flying. And I would go up every day on a flight and monitor communications, and then I'd do little mini lessons with my students on what they were saying wrong or what they were misunderstanding from their English-speaking instructor. There is very little technical vocabulary in Persian. So international aviation uses English, and it was pretty much mandatory in Iran that they use English because they didn't have any vocabulary to substitute. So the lexical items, for those of you who teach English, were all English anyway. I was mainly working on grammar so that they would understand, make sure that they could understand how to go through their checklist, what commands the instructor was giving them, and things like that. My second legacy from going to Afghanistan, when I got through graduate school, I came back to the US, I changed careers. I realized I didn't like teaching English. And even though I had this master's degree in English education, I decided I did not want to do that. So I completely changed careers. When I finished grad school, I came looking for a job up in Minnesota because I had been an undergraduate in Minnesota. And I also came to Minnesota because they had an adoption program that allowed single women to adopt. Now, I had wanted to adopt from Afghanistan or Iran. And by that time, this is 1980, both countries were at war. So adoption from there was not available. But northern India and Afghanistan used to be all one empire. So I figured that an Indian adoption was all I was, pretty much the same. So this is my first baby arriving when I was single. I could go to the airport for these adoptions, walk in this pre-security, and they would call out my name and hand me this baby. They didn't even ask for identification. I just answered to them my name, and they handed me a baby. So this is our daughter, Leela. When she arrived, she was 3 months old. She had been premature, and she weighed 8 pounds. 2 years later, my husband and I got married, and we decided to continue by adoption. And our second baby was from the same orphanage. She was also premature and arrived weighing 6 pounds. And this picture was taken after we fattened her up, because when she arrived, she was probably, straight out of any kind of famine picture you've ever seen. And this next picture, I think John's already seen on my Facebook page. Here we are on vacation last month. And my older daughter, Leela, my younger daughter, Sarah, her partner, and the love of our lives. This is our grandson. And here's my husband over here on the left. Now, I'm going to go back to Afghanistan. How have I stayed in touch with Afghanistan? This woman, Mary McMakin, is one of the few Americans that has stayed behind in Afghanistan. She considers Afghanistan her home, and she has started 2 different NGOs. The first one under the Taliban, and she actually ended up getting deported by the Taliban, but she went back in, and she has stayed ever since 2001 when she returned, and she is now a citizen of Afghanistan, and she's going to stay there. She has no intention of leaving. This guy, I don't know if any of you have ever actually met him. He used to live in Bloomington. He has since moved to California, but he was the Minister of Agriculture in Afghanistan. And when the Russians came in, he defected to the US. And this is his wife, Lila. And they started an NGO that works in Khost province, and Khost is to the southeast of Kabul. And I was part of his board, and we built schools for both boys and girls. We educated the girls. We were able to bring a class of girls all the way up through post-secondary. They became teachers, doctors, and we trained a group of midwives who were able to then go back to the village and start a clinic. One of the good news things about modern Afghanistan is that maternal mortality has dropped significantly. Life expectancy has increased now to the 50s, assuming you're not blown up. And the health standard for people in Afghanistan is much better. This guy also has remained in Afghanistan. He is an Afghan American, like Ghaffar in the previous picture. He is one of those resettled nomads that I was talking about. So we like to say that we're from the same hometown. He was a doctor in Oregon. And after he retired, he went back to Afghanistan and started some schools in Lashkargah, where I lived. So here he is in the girls' school, and you can see it's okay at that point for him to be there as a man among these girls. It would not be okay today. And this is the final Afghan that I keep in touch with. And we were like 2 ships passing in the night. We both went to college together. He was a year ahead of me. I didn't know him in college. And it was only later on I read one of his books. He's an author. His name is Tamim Ansari. And I discovered that not only had he gone to school with me at the same time, but that he had grown up in Lashkargah. And he has a fabulous book. If you ever want to know what it was like for Afghans growing up in the 60s and 70s, his memoir is called West of Kabul, East of New York. And it's about his childhood in Afghanistan and then coming to the US and some of the different choices that he and his siblings made to follow different paths. So that is the end. And I hope I left time for at least a couple of questions.
You certainly did. Awesome presentation, and so interesting. I thought a couple of times, man, people, Americans, the public should see this. I mean, should just see it. Kind of gives a human face to Afghanistan, and you kind of, the news you see, you kind of assume that everything is just doom and destruction, and it's just need to see the family relationships you built and all the rest. So let's open it up for some questions. Who has anything for Jane?
I have a question. First of all, I love the presentation. It was so interesting. My mouth just hung open when you talked about your adoption experience. I couldn't believe what you said.
Yeah.
Here's a kid.
I was curious. Did you feel like you received the same respect in Afghanistan that you would have here in the United States as a woman? And how did the level of respect you received compare to, how did it compare to Afghani women?
I would say that I was probably more respected in Afghanistan at the time, in part because in the US, I was 23 years old. I was a kid, and, who's going to, pay much attention to a 23-year-old? In Afghanistan, I was practically the age of their grandmothers. Wow. And so I was respected as an elder. I was respected because I was so large. They just didn't understand that. And, so I was kind of an alien. I was respected for having a master's degree. So all of that, kept me very much on a pedestal, so to speak. But one of the interesting things, some of you may have encountered this in some other cultures, especially in Asia, they don't understand why a woman would be by herself. And they thought that somehow I'd been kicked out of my family. And that's why I was by myself. And when Dad came to visit me, it was like, oh my God, her father acknowledges her. This is so wonderful. So I already had cred, but it went way up because my father acknowledged me. And of course, then my father was 6'2". And so they could also see why I was a giant, because he was such a giant. So that was, I would say I was pretty high up there in Afghanistan. Compared to Afghan women, it really depended on whether we were in a rural setting or an urban setting. There were a lot of professional women in Kabul. There were business women, for example. And I would say among that class, because they were wealthier, and the women had as much credibility as American women at that time. In a rural setting, it was probably closer to how we perceive the Taliban, but it wasn't out of Islam that they were acting. It was more just a tradition. The Afghans at the time were very casual Muslims. And so I never saw anyone pray, never saw anyone go to the mosque. I think this was more the culture had very traditional roles for women. Coming back to the US, I switched from being an English teacher to being a geologist. And as an English teacher, I was in a very traditional role. My mother was an English teacher, and that was fine. That's what women did in 1972. Mm-hmm. When I had been undergraduate, I wanted to be a geologist, and I was told point blank I could not be one because I was female. So I went back to English Lit. I'd already read all the books. And I came back after the 1973 oil crisis, if any of you are old enough to remember that. Mm-hmm. The oil companies were desperate for geologists. And so they were even encouraging girls to go into geology. And I was recruited into a grad program without having an undergraduate degree in geology.
That's awesome.
Having said that, there still was a lot of, like, you're a girl, you can't do this. And, I had to get through field camp. I had to get through grad school itself. And then I came up here, and I had a fabulous company that I went to work for, Bar Engineering, if any of you are familiar with it. And I did a lot of field work. And I encountered problems with the drill crews, except, again, my height was in my favor because I was almost as tall as the drillers. So, and also I kind of took a page out of my dad's book, ex-military, Colonel Willard, and I actually ended up being called Colonel Willard by most of the drill crews. So in the 70s, there were some interesting parallels between Afghanistan and the US. Just some things were good, in the US, some things were about the same.
We have about 1 minute left here. Could you just touch on, the current situation, the end of, the change in the conflict, your impressions, your feelings, how has it hit you personally, the events of the past 20 years, but the events of the past 3 months?
I can't imagine how the people of Afghanistan are responding to this. Obviously for the women, it's devastating because they've already said that girls can't go to school beyond grade school. They are allowing girls who are in school at the university to finish, but they've drastically changed how they're being instructed and who's allowed to instruct them. So it has to be a horrible situation. And I know that under the first Taliban regime, there was a very high suicide rate among women. But I think also for the men, this is not something the majority of the men wanted either, to be in this kind of situation. And so it's, we're all kind of going day by day, step by step, what's going to happen here.
Yeah.
Things are different in terms of communication. I'm still in touch with people on social media. So there wasn't that same thing. If you remember, we were all just getting into the internet in the late 90s. I mean, my first email account was 1998. Right. So in 2001, Kabul didn't really have internet. And nowadays, this is completely different. Kabul didn't have a telephone system. And, now they do have, everybody has cell phones just like they do here, at least in the urban areas. Mm-hmm. So I don't think the Taliban can get away with what they got away with before. So there is that hope. But all in all, right now, it's very depressing.
Chrisanne, did you have a question? You have yourself off mute.
No, I just took myself off mute for kicks. Jane, it was super interesting. Wow. My heart goes out to Afghanistan right now. I can't imagine being a woman there. Can't imagine it. Are you saying because of the phones and stuff, you think there might be some pushback? I mean, are you thinking?
There has already been pushback. I mean, there's been, women have openly protested in the streets They've protested at the schools, and men are protesting also. Now, the Taliban have shot a few people, but the protests are continuing, and it's not just in Kabul. They're protesting down in Jalalabad, which is one of the major cities, and it's not something that happened back in the 80s and early 90s when the Taliban were there before.
It was just a news story today that the Taliban want the opportunity to address the UN General Assembly, I think, that's currently meeting, and there's going to be a vote on it. I'm curious, slightly hopeful that might mean some difference in how things were 20 years ago as opposed to today, and there might be some change. But yeah, beginning reports out, and some of the policies being put back into place are not positive, are they?
I think that the Afghans that are not Taliban they're much more sophisticated than they were 20 years ago. And even 20 years ago, they were much more sophisticated than they were when I was there. Mm-hmm. So, it's not dealing with the same group of people. A lot of people have migrated internally to the major cities. So the demographics of Afghanistan have changed. And I think that was starting in the 80s and 90s, but in the last 20 years, that's really been a big push. And so, it's different than when the Taliban were in control before.
Could I end on a more positive note? There used to be a fabulous restaurant in Bloomington called Dafgan. I love that place, and I don't think it's there anymore. Is there a good Afghani restaurant?
Okay, two answers to that question. The couple I showed you, where he was the Minister of Agriculture and his wife Lila, Lila owned that restaurant.
So good.
Her brother had started it, and then she bought it from him. So yes, I was very familiar with Afghan. The restaurant I go to is the Khyber Pass in St. Paul.
Okay.
And if I'm in the western suburbs, there's a little fast food place called Ariana that is on Louisiana, I think, south of 394, 94. And it's like a, fast food, great food.
I'll check it out. That's very near where I am. Thank you. Thanks for a really wonderful presentation, Jane. I'm going to share the Rotary four-way test here. If we can all take ourselves off of mute. So one more forward, one moment. Okay, Rotary four-way test of the things that we think, say, and do. Is it the
truth?
Is it
fair to all concerned?
Will it
build
goodwill and better friendships?
And will
it be beneficial to all concerned?
I'm kind of convinced we all actually are saying it exactly at the same time, but because of the delays, it comes off as very funny. A round of applause for Jane. Really great to get.
Really wonderful. Really, really wonderful.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for just a great presentation.
And for my next act, I will give you an hour on Iran.
Oh, that would be lovely.